talked about the different categories of spam in terms of on-page spam and off-page link sort of spam. And what Sean and I are going to do is kind of elaborate on each one of those topics a little bit. So I'm going to talk about on-page spam and just come up with a couple of examples where people are targeting the search engines with these kinds of spam. So let's see. There we go. Okay, so one of the big aspects of on-page spam is, as Nathan mentioned, showing something to search engines and showing something completely different to users. And Phantom Cloaker was the software that you mentioned, I believe. And cloaking is essentially where the server that's hosting the content checks the HTTP request and tries to figure out who's asking for this content. In fact, all search engines, the crawler will identify themselves as being from Googlebot or Yahoo Slurp or one of the crawlers. Whereas a request from a normal browser that you would have on your machine would identify as being Mozilla Firefox or Internet Explorer or something of that sort. So the server can actually check that and display different content to the search engines and to the browser. So for example, in this case, you'll find that users can actually see the page that's on the left, which looks fairly pretty. It's a blog post and so forth. And what Googlebot sees on the right is just a bunch of links to really, really nasty content. And the goal of that is essentially to say, Googlebot thinks this page has a certain amount of reputation, and only Googlebot is going to see that reputation flow out to all those links. So that's what the spammer has essentially done. Now, it turns out that this particular blog, it's not the webmaster that's doing anything malicious. It turns out that the blog was hacked. And the hackers have essentially set it up so that it would cloak Googlebot and pass all of the reputation out. So one of the things to be careful about is also to make sure that your PHP installs and your WordPress installs and all these kinds of things are at the latest versions and to make sure that it's all secure and tied down like that. Okay. So another way of displaying different content to a user versus a search engine is to use redirects in a way that's not easily decipherable by search engines. Typically, what most search engine crawlers will do is they will download the page, but they won't execute any JavaScript that's on the page. So if you see something like a meta redirect in the header of the HTML, search engines can understand that. But executing complicated JavaScript, that might not be easy for a search engine. So what spammers will tend to do is to create a page that looks fairly decent to a search engine, and then in the JavaScript redirect to a page that's spam, or that gets the user to click on ads or something of that sort. So in this case, for example, when a user goes to this page, he's immediately redirected to a site that's a drugstore that's selling Cialis and all of these fun things. And of course, it's very patriotic because it's got a bald eagle on the top left. None of that Canadian spam. When Googlebot goes and visits the page, all it sees is all the terms related to Cialis because it doesn't execute the JavaScript that goes off and redirects the user right away. And you know that this is not, there are legitimate uses for redirects, but you know that this one is particularly malevolent because if you examine the JavaScript, you can see at the top there that they're checking for who the referrer is, and then they're actually rewriting the window location at the bottom after checking to make sure that it's either from Google or MSN or Yahoo or something of that sort. So there's really no legitimate intent for this kind of a redirect. Another way you can display different content to users versus search engines is to simply hide it on the page. So in this case, this is not the vodka site. It's a film production site, I believe. On the left, the user sees, because the browser interprets CSS and actually hides all of the text that's at the bottom there. When you disable the CSS, you suddenly see all of these keywords pop up, and that's what the search engines are going to see as well, and use that content as terms on the page that it would respond to. By examining the CSS, we can see that the intent was really pretty bad. Another way of doing hidden text is not necessarily by CSS, but by including something in just a 1-point font. So if you look at the HTML that's up there, font size 1 point, clearly they intended for users to see it on screens that are 56 inches or something. But yeah, so the page looks pretty decent by itself, but this text is on there, and I don't know if it's visible. Yeah, it's not visible on that screen, but there's tiny white dots at the bottom of the page, and that's actually the text. They're literally 1 pixel wide. Sometimes spammers don't even bother hiding it. They just put the content up there, and even a user going to the page looks at it and goes, yeah, that kind of looks really bad. So the example at the top, I'm thinking that the site might be about jobs. I don't know. So I get that feeling. And it's because, they've just repeated these keywords over and over again on the page. And certainly it's not a great user experience to see something like that. At least that text parses. The text at the bottom, the example there, doesn't even parse. It's not even valid English. It's just random keywords that are placed in there. It's complete gibberish. So clearly this was not meant as a good user experience. This is all these keywords are just fodder for the search engines to be able to index the site for those keywords. Another example of spam that we see, which is not necessarily hiding text in any way, is just creating lots of content in the hope that many pages will have a better chance of having the site rank in the search engines. And that's the concept of doorway pages, where you create thousands of pages. For example, this site had flights to St. George, flights to Dalby, flights to Tari, flights to all of these different locations. And the pages are almost identical, except for at the top right, you'll see tickets to St. George, and that would change to tickets to Dalby or tickets to Tari or something of that sort. But that's it. Nothing else on the page would really change. So clearly these are not meant as a better user experience. Each of those pages have very specifically crafted titles to make sure that the search engines index them for those specific terms. So really what they're doing is creating tons of pages. Each one of them is targeting one very specific query. And that's not a good user experience either, so we don't really encourage that. And the final point that I want to get to is the concept of scraping. Now we saw a lot of examples where people create content and they serve one set of content to users and one set of content to search engines. Another big factor is, well, where do they get this content from? And the typical black hat spammer might actually be fairly lazy and not want to create their own content. So what they're going to do is scrape blogs and scrape RSS feeds and so forth. Now, a lot of the search engines try to look at this text and try to make sure that we do